Hi, and welcome to the Infinite Canvas. I'm Rachel Neighbors, and today I have a very special guest on the show, Greg Tarnoff. Hey, Greg.
Hi, Rachel.
How are you doing today?
I'm actually having a pretty fun day when it comes to my vertigo.
Wonderful. What is this vertigo you speak of?
Well, I have a vestibular disorder. My inner gyroscope is broken, and so I'm constantly dizzy.
Whoa, constant dizziness reminds me of when I used to take ballet classes. So this is interesting, and one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show specifically. I've been traveling a lot this year, talking at conferences about web animations and using them to improve the user experience on websites, making them feel more app-like, if you will. And for a large number of users, this sort of thing really does make the web feel more useful and usable and
Right.
intuitive. But for users like you, this is actually an accessibility nightmare. And I wanted to know if we could talk to you today a little bit about what it's like for you to use those kinds of websites and what we can do as designers wielding animation to be more responsible and accommodate you more.
That sounds great. I'm all for that. I've been talking this last year as well about what it's like to be me at a couple of conferences and trying to induce motion sickness upon the audience, which is always fun.
Are you going to induce motion sickness on us today?
There may be some of that.
All
So,
right.
I may scroll through things a little quickly to kind of maybe give you an idea of what things are good, what it's like for me, but it's not intended to really make you sick or ill.
So, vestibular disorder, I take it because it's a disorder. It's been codified and recorded, and there's a set of things that doctors use to diagnose you. Um, do they vary from person to person? Is it like a physical defect in the inner ear? Like, what can you tell us about the the serious doctor business of this disorder?
So, a vestibular disorder is sort of an umbrella term.
Okay.
There's a number of things that you could possibly have that qualify as vestibular disorder. It's like cancer. There's breast cancer. There's colon cancer. There's brain cancer. Vestibular disorder is it's a default of the vestibular system, which is comprised of four main parts. One is your inner ear, which helps with your balance. One is your sense of space, and one is your ocular system. And then those three talking to your brain. Now, in my particular case, it's the talking to your brain part that is actually problematic. All of my systems work properly, but my brain can't process the data that's coming in. Other people very commonly will have a problem with their inner ear. Something that people may have heard of is Meniere's disease that will actually cause that. And there's also Bppv, benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, which is usually a temporary state where the crystals in your inner ear actually move out of the chamber that they're supposed to be in. And as you move your head back and forth, they rock and they throw off your inner ear system.
That's right. We do have little crystals in our tiny ears.
Yeah, yeah. So that's always a little bit fun. Um, so that's what's going on with a vestibular disorder. So it's a wide variety of things. Some people can't
Okay.
even get out of bed. Some people can maneuver and have just dizzy spells. I'm a combination of both.
Do some people get vestibular disorders as they get older?
Yeah, actually, there is a pretty good showing that about 40% of adults, or 35 to 40% of adults over 40 have had some sort of chronic or temporary vestibular disorder.
I
And
know older
that's
people tend to get dizzy a lot. I was wondering if it might be, for some people, age related as well, that you can end up with these problems as you get older.
Well, yeah. One of the things is that yeah, as we get older, our systems start to break down. Now the thing is, there's also you can get dizziness from low blood pressure,
Mm.
standing up too quickly, things like that, and that is actually considered different than a vestibular disorder.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, that's interesting. So how many people in the population are afflicted with vestibular disorder?
It sometimes it's really hard to tell because not everybody gets diagnosed, and sometimes they go away. But the latest numbers are showing about 35% of people over 40 have had one at one point or another in their life.
Interesting. And what about chronic people?
The numbers are a little bit harder to come by, but it does look like there's about 20% of the population has issues with motion sickness and vestibular type of disorders on a regular basis.
Interesting. So the other day, my husband and I were talking a bit about vestibular disorders, and he's a front end developer, and so we talk about web development quite a bit. And I love animation, and we were talking a bit about how what it must be like to use the internet that's becoming increasingly more animated space. It's starting to feel more and more appy. It used to be just a series of linked documents with the odd flash game, which you could turn flash off at least. But as people are adding more and more animation to their linked documents, there's no real way to turn it off. And as I was telling him about this, he brought up a really good analogy. He doesn't like 3D movies. He can't watch them without getting sick. So I don't get to see many 3D movies. We go to see the regular 2D kind. But imagine if all movies were made as 3D movies. I would never get to see another movie with my husband because he just wouldn't be able to get into the theater. So imagine if all websites were animated, then you'd have these users who simply could not use websites because it would make them sick. It would be like afflicting everyone who goes to the movies with a 3D movie. So that was a really good way for him to put it, because quite a few people who watch movies simply cannot take the 3D movies. And my
Yeah.
husband is one of them.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. It's a really good comparison. And yeah, no, I cannot handle 3D movies or IMAX or even like the big ultra screens.
That's all right. That's why we have this wonderful 2D technology that flattens the screen for you. So, all right, let's talk a little bit more about what sorts of different kinds of things can trigger motion sickness for people who might be suffering from vestibular disorders to varying degrees. I know we bring this one up a lot. It was very popular as soon as we discovered we could move things around on the page. Parallax, and I should make sure that in this case we know that we're defining parallax as when something moves on a screen and the things are moving at different speeds on the screen. I'm not
Right.
talking about those showy Heidi card things. I'm talking about different rates of motion on the site. Um, that can be very triggering. Am I correct?
Yeah, it can be. Depending on the depth that they're doing and the speed difference between them, it can be extremely triggering. And unfortunately, there's no hard and fast rule as to how to do it right because every individual is slightly different. And,
Right.
and the depth of things has a bigger difference. So some things that are super, super deep are really triggering to me. But things that are closer together and move at a slightly different pace that are more like 8-bit Nintendo side scrollers are, much easier to handle.
It's interesting. I was just watching a really great teardown of Michael Bay and his filming process by Tony Zhou, and I was wondering, do you ever watch Michael Bay films?
I do. Lots of lens flares, people looking up, shots of butts. I
Those
love them.
circle shots he does, do they ever give you the dizzies?
Yes.
Because Tony Zhou was talking about how much parallax and depth he uses to get those circle shots to work. And we were talking about great motion over long distances and depth, and I thought, I wonder if even on a 2D screen, if that's terribly triggering for you.
The other one that also does it in the movies is the zoom where they zoom in on the individual but the background drops away
The
because
dolly zoom,
they're doing the focal length is changing. That one really that messes me up too pretty good.
which was used in Vertigo, and I imagine the first time people saw that in theaters, it gave them vertigo. Yeah, Alfred Hitchcock. It was so clever. It's basically you put the camera on a little cart, and you pull it while zooming in, so the subject remains in focus, but the background perspective changes rapidly. This can be done really slowly and subtly too in some films, just to unnerve the audience. Like, you wouldn't even notice it unless it was pointed out to you in a film class, but it's just done as a subtle way of making you think the perspective is off. Physics in this world is being disrupted. So, very good way to get people to freak out. Maybe not a good way to get them to come back to the movie. So, what about also frame rates? Do frames per second, are they ever triggering? They may not be, but we talk a lot about consistency and 30 versus 60 versus 200 frames per second.
I think really the key is to make sure that you're in that sweet zone of over 30. When you get below 30, then it starts to get janky. And when you get janky, then that's like start, stop. And that actually throws me off and a number of people that I know who also have a vestibular disorders off. So the smoother you can get, the faster your frame rates can get, the easier it is to digest. Now, that doesn't mean that the animation goes fast. It just goes smooth.
So that said, have you any experience with motion blurs? Either in, like, I've seen some really cute SVG motion blur demos on CodePen, and also motion blur is commonly used in gaming, is a game setting. And this can help, because the human eye actually perceives somewhere closer to 200 frames per second. 60 frames per second is close, but some people turn motion blur on, some people turn it off. Do you have any experience with motion blur?
The few SVG animations that I've seen are a little bit easier to digest, but in games, and I don't play a lot of video games. I can't imagine why. But in games, I find that it is not something that necessarily helps me.
Okay. And that said, all right. In iOS, they have a way to decrease motion. And what it does, at least now, it's going to be changing soon. More on that later. What it does is it essentially removes most of the sliding effects and replaces them with opacity and fades. Is that an improvement, or is that still triggering for some people?
It's still triggering, but it is definitely an improvement, and so, like I said, it's a spectrum. Everybody's a little bit different.
Right.
I definitely had to turn them on. iOS introduced the parallax of just shifting your phone as you're holding it in your hand and giving that 3D effect, or the moving, or Android has this as well. You have the animated backgrounds on the lock screen. Those things bother me tremendously. So I turn that stuff off, and things that snap a little bit more, and fade is fine, the dissolve concept, but things that snap a little bit more are definitely much better for preventing me from actually getting a vertigo attack.
Excellent. What about color changes?
Color changes, if they're subtle, are not usually problematic. Subtle and slow. If you go from a red to a green fairly quickly, it's going to be problematic. But if you stay in the green-blue range, then it's much easier to digest.
Cool. And I guess lastly, what about size? Like, when some people, they want to give a modal a little pop on the page by making it do a little grow shrink.
Please don't. Though that actually bothers me, and that's one of the things that iOS had, is because the way it would pop into the view screen, it was actually moving depending on how where you had things set, and the way the app was doing it, as fast as 250 miles an hour coming at your face. Now, that's really kind of crazy, but even a little pop like a modal like that can be running 16, 20 miles per hour as far as the perception goes. And that definitely is something that will set me off.
And I think we were talking about on Twitter about this, but different directions of motion can be more triggering for some people than others. I think you were saying that, was it vertical or horizontal motion is less of a concern for you, but more of a concern for one of your friends?
Yeah, vertical motion is less of a concern for me. My particular disorder, everything looks like it's spinning counterclockwise in the world. So I actually perceive the world rotating that way. And so when we have left to right movement, it either is going with it and making me feel like I'm falling left, or it's going against it, and then my brain is having a harder time processing. But up and down, vertical scrolling, is much easier for me. But a few of my friends have had problems with that as well because of the way that their vestibular disorder affects them.
Wow. Well, it sounds like people vary a lot. There's no such thing as one implementation of animation to rule them all, is there?
There really isn't. Unlike blindness and low vision, there's no, standard as to what this actually is, and there's no set of tools out there right now to just be able to implement and say, hey, we're going to cover this by doing it this way.
Yeah, I've recently been consulting with a large company that's been building out an animation portion of their style guides, and they've got a really great accessibility team. They've been going through making sure that everything is high contrast, that it's got great screen reader controls, and they're doing everything accessible by default. And they wanted to know if I could make animations accessible by default. And I said it's not possible because people are so different. For instance, it takes some people 70 milliseconds to recognize a change has occurred on a screen, and it takes other people 700 milliseconds. That's the range of some of these ocular studies. That's a range of magnitude of 10. It's well, not a magnitude of 10. That's not how magnitudes work. But you're talking about you're talking about a huge difference there.
Right.
And one person takes 10 times as long to recognize that something on the screen has changed, and the other person immediately picks up on it. So when you're saying, well, what's the ideal speed for an animation? I actually think maybe there should be some system settings where the user can decide how fast things should or should not be running, and that way they can adjust. They can adjust animation lengths to suit themselves. Fortunately, with the Web Animation API in the future, it should be possible for browsers to give people this kind of control,
Right.
even the control to hopefully turn animations off, which brings me to the big suggestion I make to people when they ask, how do I make animations accessible on my site? I say, you need to install an off switch or a reduce animation slash motion option like iOS does. I don't see many sites doing this, but I did see one do it, and I should probably screen share that in a moment. And I was wondering, have you seen anybody use an off switch in the wild?
I haven't, in fact. It's something that I've been toying around with. I put a code pen up with a little demo of how it could possibly work, and I've actually started a JavaScript library. I just haven't had time to work on it. The idea
JavaScript
being that the idea is that if we subclass everything under everything that we're animating under an animate class or an animation on class, then we can use some very vanilla JavaScript to go in and say, turn this on, turn this off by just removing that class. That's my concept. I have it out there, and it's as open source, but without a whole lot of code behind it at this moment. Just because I haven't been able to write it as much as I want to.
There's also the option of, I would think, for users adding a super important user style sheet that takes all the things and puts their animations and transitions to none or paused.
There is. The problem there is that when we start getting the user style sheets, it's fine for people that are front end developers that know what they're doing. When it comes to your 75-year-old grandmother who isn't, a technologically native person, trying to do a user style sheet can be really complex. I can even struggle with it. So
But
how
will using a JavaScript library help her any? Or
well, if the JavaScript library is something that somebody uses as a package installer, like Bower or Browserify, as part of their constructing their website, that puts a big switch at the top that says turn animation off, it very well could be. So that's my concept behind having a kill switch. I do. It would be nice to be able to have something in the browser for someone to just say kill these animations. But one of the things is if it's not us as developers and designers creating that, what will end up happening is when those animations are off and a person gets to say the second section, the second screen of the website here that's giving them all the sales pitch or the information they need, and that stuff isn't animated to where they can read it, we're not delivering a user experience that they're going to enjoy.
right. So let me share with you the one experience that I've found where somebody installed a reduce animation option. So as you can see, as I'm moving my mouse, this is a website about some fish, and
Okay.
it's a cartoon. And as you scroll, you can see that everything has parallax. But
Right.
this little unnamed switch up here, if you hit it, suddenly the parallax is reduced completely to just one background image that moves. So there's less of a depth
Wow.
effect. And I'm pretty sure that what happened here was that whoever commissioned this site looked at the parallax effect and was like, that's too much, you have to turn it off. And the designer was like, but it's cool, no. And so he's like, you have to offer a way to turn it off. And so they put a little switch in and didn't bother to name it just to satisfy that one person. I'm pretty sure that's what must have happened.
I probably, and this is great. I mean, this is amazing. I honestly don't think so. This parallax is definitely makes me sick, but the fact that it's sort of focused around this logo in the center here makes it a little bit easier to swallow. But definitely being able to flip that switch off is amazing and makes the site itself a lot easier for me to actually deal with.
Brilliant. Could you share your code pens of how you've done it too?
Sure. It's a pretty janky animation to begin with, so let's ignore that. But basically, we have the ability to turn off the animation. It's the same idea as that toggle switch there. Um, and so we can turn it on and we can turn it off. And it was very, very primitive. And let me see if I go back here. We can actually look at our code, um, which is pretty simple. And people are free to fork this and look at it. But I just have the animation class being on, and then I use is basically jQuery to switch it and turn that and change that text of what the label is. And it was really fast. There's no live region on here or anything like that to update ARIA on screen readers if the label changes. So this was just a really fast prototype to see, can I even do this? And it was a good start. So I'm trying to take it a little bit further with this JavaScript library. But as you can see, I started it 26 days ago and haven't actually written any code since my first commit. So definitely something I need to get back to.
Absolutely, and let me know when you have more going. I'd love to share it with the Web Animation Weekly readership. I'm sure they'd be really excited.
Definitely.
So could you
Definitely.
show us a couple of examples, or maybe all of the examples? I know we talked about doing a rundown of all the motion and telling us a bit about what's done well, what's not done well, things that people could have taken into consideration.
Sure. Sure. Well, one of the things that just popped up this morning for me, a friend sent me this new palette
Uh-huh.
tab. And it's a discovering new colors, in the Chrome store, and It's running a little slower right now. I think that's probably because we've got all these different things running on the machine at the moment. But as you can see here, this animation on the left-hand side is constantly scrolling. And that, when I first looked at
Is
it
it doing that on its
on
own? You're
my,
not scrolling your mouse?
I'm not doing it. It's doing it all on its own.
Okay.
And so that's clue number one is it's not user initiated animation. User initiated animation is always much easier to swallow than automated animation. Or if you are going to have automated animation, there's got to be a clue that this is about to
What kind
begin.
of clue?
So, well, let's take video for example, because I'm having a hard time at the moment thinking exactly what the clue would be. But if I click on a YouTube video or I click on a link that says GIF on it, I anticipate that to actually move.
You have a
So
little
when it
time to
starts
mentally
moving,
prepare yourself.
exactly. But if I click on a link that I don't recognize, and this is where link shorteners become a little bit hectic and crazy, they end up taking me to something, and it may have auto playing audio or movement because it's a video or even a GIF. And that surprises me. And having that surprise makes it more difficult to
I
actually
imagine
tolerate.
so.
So dropping into this, and it's actually a really pretty animation. It's a really nicely designed site. I think it's a really cool concept. The fact that it's animating and I can't stop it from animating is the piece that is
I feel like I
problematic
should
to me.
also mention here an interesting account I read in Animals in Translation by Temple Grandin. For listeners who don't know who Temple Grandin is a woman on the autistic spectrum who works with designing systems for the processing of animals that we eat. So she's famously the woman who designed the quote unquote stairway to heaven for cattle slaughter that McDonald's uses in its humanely slaughtered cattle requirements. She believes that her particular autism lets her see the world more like animals do. And it's a really cool book. It's totally worth reading. It makes you think about things very differently and what it means to be human even. What we're always looking for what makes humans different from those other animals, and the answers you might come up with might surprise you. So anyway, interesting thing she mentioned in that book was that she has problems being in offices because of screensavers. Because if there's something moving on someone's screen, she can't help but look at it. This is when she was talking about animacy and how like horses get freaked out when they see a bag on the side of the road because their whole system is queued up around looking for motion in their peripheral, and that it's horribly distracting for especially prey animals to have something animated or moving. So maybe you have a dairy farm and there's like some toy or something that someone has on their desk at the stanchion, and it might just freak all the animals out when they walk past it, and the farmer would never know because they're not looking like an animal. It's kind of like a big UX for animals book, and I love it. But looking at this, I'm just thinking, I bet Temple Grandin would hate the sight. She would be distracted by it. Like, you'd
Yeah,
be trying to have a conversation, she'd just be staring over your shoulder at this, like, completely in the zone.
yeah, no, that's how I feel. And while I don't necessarily have issues with screensavers when I'm walking through an office, humans are wired that
Yes.
way too. Where we were as we were in the primordial ages and coming down out of the trees and looking for hunting
Being
and
hunted.
gathering. We were prey, and so we are wired that way. And so when I hear things like that, and yes, she's on the autism spectrum. There are people with ADD. If they see something flashing, they get distracted by it. I wonder how much of those are actually disabilities versus actually just being closer to your primordial self in being in tune with those things.
Yeah.
Um,
I've read really interesting accounts of how some people have more of a catch and kill mindset than other people, and this mindset's less useful in modern day. For instance, I'm very good at catching animals. but that's not really a skill that helps me in an office, and how modern man is still coming out of the trees. So it's interesting that something like this might not just be horrible for people with vestibular disorders, but could be very bad for people who are a little bit more sensitive to animacy for other reasons. And who knows what the percentages
Right.
of users for those people are like as well.
Yeah.
So let's check out another site. This is fun.
All right.
If you can bear it.
So maybe people are familiar with this. It got a lot of buzz a couple of weeks ago. We have this wonderful article
I can still see
trying
it when
to
I close
explain
my
to
eyes.
the non-coder what is actually it's like to be a
Okay.
coder. So Bloomberg did this, and it's it's 38,000 words. I have not actually even read this article. I've read like cliff notes of the cliff
Okay.
notes of the article. Because I got here and one right away, the colors in the background, they're not even moving and they're bothering me. They're triggering me because of the vibration patterns and the erratic and it not being a consistent pattern. So when I say vibration patterns, hopefully everybody's familiar with their color palettes, and you have two colors that sit next to each other, and you get this dark line or a bright line where they meet and they sort of vibrate next to each other. And that's why we have to be really careful when we pick colors and put them next to each other so that we try to avoid that. Well, that's already bothering me. Then we get the blinking cursor over here, which is a fairly easy rate, no big deal. But as I started to scroll down into this article, I was able to read fairly easily for the first section of it, but I'm still being bothered because it's on the edges over here of that color. But when we get a little bit further, there is a point where we start to get a few more things. Now you see that I actually have Adobe Flash turned off, so there's animations and stuff that play in here that normally would just sort of go, and I turn them off by default, so I don't have to see these things as they first pop up. I don't even know what this one is.
T-Mobile knows your
It's an
business doesn't
ad.
stop at the
It's an ad.
4G LTE data in
Well,
Mexico and
It's a really big ad. So we're going to scroll right past that and just keep going. Here's the little guy.
the,
So this little guy is throughout the article doing different things. He's sort of your Clippy, and right here he's just rotating around, no big deal. But as we get deeper into the article, he starts to do a little bit more, and they have a few things that pop, and um, that were throwing me off. And I think this,
ah,
yep, right here. This is,
whoa.
yeah, this is where I stopped reading. And because the entire background changes, and again, we still have vibrating patterns and random patterns and things like that. And the entire thing changes though, and it really made me sick at that point. And I literally had to get up and walk away from the computer. So much so that I'm actually going to close this because my CPU is like going
I
off the
can hear
roof at
it.
the
It's
moment.
not happy with you at all.
No, I made the mistake of playing Flash. It doesn't like that. It's starting to calm down again. But yeah, that change in color. It's a long article, which long tracks of text have a tendency to make it very difficult for me to read, especially when they're that wide. We probably have heard, if you want to keep your text columns fairly narrow, between 45 and 75 characters, so it's easy to track back and forth. And it's really true for me because I don't see straight lines anymore. And so when I try to track from right to left to go to the next line, I can actually have some difficulty doing that because text actually looks like it's sort of on a wave for me at this point. And so long text, reading books really becomes cumbersome. And when you start to throw animation and color changes like what his code has, I ended up being really quite ill from reading that. So I gave up.
Do you use an e-reader?
I have an e-reader on my iPad. I'll use VoiceOver on my iPad and with the Kindle and the iBooks applications, and I love it. So it's not that I just turn it on and just let it read to me. I'm a more active reader than that. But what I'll do is I'll turn it on and then I don't have to follow every single word. I don't have to hit every single line. And I listen to it at a really fast clip, about 350
Whoa.
words per minute. And I can get through a book really, really fast that way. So I really like having that ability. That being said, I'm actually preferring comics lately, mostly because they're a little bit easier to digest because you can digest them a single cell at a
So,
time.
are you using an e-reader for your comics, like Comixology or something?
I do have Comixology installed, but I subscribe to Marvel Universe or Marvel Unlimited. So I've got like their entire back catalog that I'm working through, which absolutely to me is brilliant because there's so many good comics in there that I still have to
So,
read.
something I've always wondered about comics e-readers is I take it you're using the cell by cell reading way, and doesn't it move between those cells?
So actually, I'm not using the cell by cell reading
Ah,
away. Uh, the only time I do that is if I'm holding it portrait, which is usually, and I come across a two-page spread, and then I'll zoom in, and but it's a triggered animation, and I know what kind of animation it's going to do, and it's easier to digest. Like we said before, having a clue and knowing what's going to happen is always easier than not
well,
having
I
a
never
clue.
thought I'd hear someone say that comic books make reading more accessible. That makes me happy. As a person who used to make comics, so
Well, the thing about it is, there's more to it than just the
yes,
words. You have the artwork and the way the page pieces
the
together, and
layout.
you have discrete pieces within the layout where you can read and focus, and so it's you don't get 300-400 words in a soliloquy. You get them broken down into 20 to 30 different, sentences and here and there as you move through the book. And so you digest pieces, smaller pieces, and that always makes it a little bit
Well,
easier.
maybe the sum of human knowledge can be distilled to comics. I sure hope so. So, what's this you're sharing with us?
So, Code Drops or timhannis.net always has really interesting UI elements and experiments that they do. And this is one that came across they call it a subtle tilt effect for your images. And as you mouse over,
What?
you can actually get the image to move within a 3D space. And they're doing this with the use of opacity in order to get it to do this kind of stuff and moving it. And they go into how it actually works a little bit here, where they're sort of copying multiple layers and creating that effect to get a little bit of motion. And there's a couple different techniques that you can do. But having those multiple layers of opacity is very
I'm not
sickening
sure
to
why
me.
someone would use this effect.
I'm not
It's
entirely sure
interesting, but
either,
I
but
can't imagine using it in a design. I'm sure somebody will come up with a really great use of it somewhere, but I wonder why someone would do
yeah.
this.
Well, there's something to be said about experimenting.
Yeah.
Experiments are great because it allows us to understand the limits of what we can do. But once we understand the limits of what we can do, we have to sit there and decide, well, now that we can create an atomic bomb, should we create an atomic bomb? Now, obviously, this is not an atomic bomb, but within each group of what we can do, we always need to ask, what should we do? And I think this is a case of discovering our limits, and then when it's time to step back and say, I really don't
I
recommend
think this.
this.
I'm looking at this and thinking this would be really cool in an interactive horror novel. But I'm always thinking of how you can use effects to tell an interesting interactive story better.
Now, see, this one's a
Yeah.
little bit different. It's a little bit more parallaxy. It kind of gets at that dolly effect that we were talking about
Ah.
earlier. Even the fact that it's out of focus, once it starts moving, is a little bit problematic. Um, and same here, because even though we have this really cute, adorable animal, it gets really creepy
Huh.
really quickly.
Yeah.
So it's another one that stuck out to me as being problematic. I haven't seen it used anywhere, but it was problematic. And so I find a lot of things that a lot of these experiments can be, um, but at the same time, they can also be really, really
Hmm.
interesting. The fact that we can do these things now on the web is really sort of exciting. So here's another one that they put out: text styles, not textile, and hover effects. And so this one made the rounds a couple of months ago, and the effect here is that as we move over the text, we actually alter the way it works or the
Okay.
way it looks.
So it's an advanced hover
This one,
effect.
it really is an advanced hover effect. That one, the Kukuri, with this stripe is a little bit bothersome. If I'm having a good day, it doesn't really bug me. Right now, it does. Um, this one is better because it's not movement. We're just doing the fade with the color, and then we've got the background elements. So it's much
And it
more
has a
subtle for
centering
me.
element.
Yeah, and then this one this one annoys me greatly because what actually happens is the kerning
Mm.
changes. And so now the letters that I'm focusing in on, especially when I'm looking towards the middle of the word, they're moving quite a bit. And he says I'm getting all the periphery
Right, it looks
action.
like it's squeezing.
Yep. And here, the K rotating doesn't bother me so much. I'm actually more bothered by the quick flip to the dark
Mm.
colors. So it's really kind of interesting how every animation is slightly different, even within one person.
Yeah, I imagine we could bring someone else here and have them look at the same thing, and different ones would work differently for them because their own personal
Exactly.
differences.
So again, here we've got motion left to right and right to left from two different directions and the change of color. And this, while that in itself doesn't necessarily make me sick, I'm left with after image.
Mm.
And it's the after image moving disjointedly from the actual image that gives sort of that tilt effect that we just saw in the previous site, and it throws me off that way. So I'm actually going to close this one before I get too sick and try to remember. I guess I have to refresh this one. So even loading numbers can actually be problematic. Um, but as we start to get in here, I mean, this is some beautiful artwork. But as I scroll,
Are you
it's
scrolling
really,
to have this
really,
happen? This is all parallax.
I'm scrolling. This
Oh
is
my
all
gosh.
parallax, and it's super, super
This is
sensitive.
is this the same animation studio that did Madoka?
I don't
All
actually
right,
know.
I'm a an animation fan, so especially Japanese animation. It's a series I'm a big fan of.
Um, so I mean, as you get into it, it's
Ah, I see.
as it zooms, it's a very, very sensitive zoom, and so it zooms really,
There's no
really
motion
quickly.
blur on these, so everything looks very disjointed and very chunky, especially over here.
Yeah. So it was. Well, it doesn't look any less
It's
chunky
then
over
that's
here.
just got terrible
Uh,
frame rate.
Yeah, and so that constant zooming in and zooming out. If you're going to do the scroll jacking, which is really try not to do scroll jacking because it is cumbersome for a lot of people. But when you do that, you need to keep it at a rate that's going to be smooth, so that when I make a small movement, um, it's not going to drive. It's not going to drive basically a few hundred feet worth of depth going
Have
in
you
there.
seen the latest scroll snap spec? What
I
do you think
have,
about this?
and I'm really mixed. I love the idea of having it in there because people are using that. I've used it. I've built a couple of pages in the past for marketing and landing pages that it would have been really, really nice to have that in there and do less with the actual JavaScript and get all of these errors and memory issues that you're going to end up with if you're having something that's going on for an extensive period of time. But at the same time, I'm not sure that I want people encouraging that sort of functionality.
Yeah, I was just thinking if there were scroll snapping for something like this, it might make it a little bit less intense.
Definitely, definitely.
Cool
So,
example.
I think a lot of people might be familiar with this one and the next one in particular. So, back to our friends over at Apple. They do the stuff with iOS, and they put a bunch of animation in there, which makes sense. But they give you the ability to control it. And they've also done a really good job with a lot of accessibility inside their products. For instance, you can buy a MacBook Air with VoiceOver in it for less than you can actually purchase the JAWS VoiceOver
Wow,
software.
really?
Um,
Whoa.
yeah, and then JAWS needs to be updated every year. In addition to that, and so JAWS is a great tool and it works really, really well for a lot of people, and it is so much more in depth than VoiceOver. But there's the fact that you've got this tremendously expensive piece of software for people who need it that may or may not be covered by insurances. And then you've got, a computer that you can buy for a little bit less that has some really good software built into it. I think they're sort of changing the market in that regard, and the iPhone certainly has changed the way a lot of people with low vision deal with the world around them and just navigating. So when we have that, and then we come to a site like this, that now, okay, so we went and blurred real quickly. This text is very hard for me to read, and the blurred background doing that blurring background actually quickly nauseates me. And then we get into our scroll snap type areas, and then we get these things animating in behind the scenes, and they're distracting as well. So if you haven't used music yet, you get those little bubbles that you have to click on to figure out what it is you like, and they're hovering here in the background. Um, and then we have this globe to representing beats one, and the globe itself really isn't problematic, but it goes to this blur, and then there's this little pulsating going background here, and that actually is quite distracting to me. And then
What?
we go into a video that quickly fades out from the video, and then we've got motion in the background. And this is just one of those things that I really feel like should never be done. This sort of really subtle motion in the background while I'm trying to read something is very difficult to deal with having vestibular disorder. I feel like I'm constantly falling off, the chair that I'm in.
So this is the Mac Pro site. I remember this.
Yeah, so they launched this. It was pretty kind of cutting edge when they first launched this website and all the things that they were doing behind the scenes on it. for the new trash can. And, as we scroll, I mean, we've seen that kind of stuff before, but it gets into actually the 3D rendering of the image and rotating through the site as you pace through it. And as you scroll, you do get a few things in here that kind of throw a little bit. We do have navigation on the side though, so it's not just all scrolling. We can actually jump and get a little bit smoother animation as it rotates through things to the different areas that they're looking to do. And I find having that animation is really key. That sort of gives the user a little bit more control. I know it's coming. I'm going to jump though, because this one, as we jump into, I think here, the fan itself, they do this rotating, and it just, this one makes me really sick when they get into the 3D rotating of the fan and the entire image. And that multi-axis rotation is one of those things that'll set me off quite a bit.
Multi-axis rotation. That's something I haven't heard before.
It's a big word.
Yeah, it is.
So, and that's one of the things that we get into when we're talking about, starting to introduce the 3D stuff, is we have the ability to rotate not only on the Z-axis, but we can also rotate on the Y-axis. And that's, that makes it a little bit harder for me to digest. If this was anything but a black background, I probably would have been falling over sick.
Whoa. Does the black background help in some way?
Well, the black background is minimal. And so I don't know that it necessarily needs to be black background, but it could have been a white background, a solid background, as opposed to having something a little bit more multi-layered.
Sweet. Shall we go to the next one?
Yeah, let's do that. So I used to live in Milwaukee, and a couple of years ago, they came out with this Milwaukee police news site, and I've used this as an example a number of times with in my talks, and it has all this really interesting stuff, but it's all parallax and multi-layered, and we have
motorcycles.
Yeah, we have it's hard to actually navigate this site a little bit because it's so responsive to scrolling. But this, we actually can come in here, and this has right to left animation as we click through these arrows for the news over the last couple of weeks. We can use the animation over here to jump down in steps. And as we scroll through this, we also get not only to the carousel of the actual statistics, but if you watch the police down below, they actually are parallaxing. And here we have 3 rows of police in parallax with the city behind them. It's even hard to keep still. It's the crazy bit about this. And then, as we get even further into the most wanted, again, we have multiple layers of parallax that are, this one always just gets me pretty sick. Yeah, and it's hard. This is where scroll snap would really be nice. Because we would be able to get to those sections a little bit easier. But we've got the thing about this is we have the motion in multiple directions. So here are those who have died in the line of duty, and so they, as this animates left and right, we also have vertical animation going on, and that gets to be where things start to really combine to create a poor user experience. And then, Squarespace. This one wasn't too bad. This is one that I came across helping a friend set up her business website. And as we scroll through it, we have the text moving at one pace, the image moving in another with the combination of the fade in, the fade out. And again, it's one of those things, it's a lot better than the Milwaukee PD site or even the Apple site.
Why is that?
I find that when the animation is limited to a smaller area, it's always easier to digest than when you're dealing with the entire page. So this being that we have just this small area for on the right hand side where the text is animating or scrolling by is a little bit easier to digest than the entire Apple site where we have a big center image that is rotating. This was one that caught my eye as well. And then I think we get into the next section here, yeah, where things are animating both the image and the text at the same time, and we've got another layer because the background is not going anywhere.
So I'm thinking to myself, I wonder how this would look if it were done in such a way that the animation was reduced or removed. How would the site work?
I think this is a really good example. The individual rotating slides that they have through here don't necessarily need to rotate, or they can be user-initiated carousel. The other piece about it is I don't know that the movement of the text necessarily brings anything. So in this particular case, this piece of it, I don't know that it needs to animate. Now, I don't really feel like this section is truly animating the text, but if the text were to come in and be tied to where the picture is at, so that you'd have a little bit, you don't have that sort of janky, they're moving at two separate speeds, it would be a lot easier. Here, because we can, with it, the text animating, it's not that big a deal. I think that this, so this one is one of those areas where we could certainly turn off animation. I don't think we lose anything, unlike some of the other sites out there that have more zooming and things coming in. In fact, let me do this. Actually, I want to jump to this one right here. So this is actually a new tool for building websites. And one of the things it prides itself on is the animation. And as we scroll, we get a little bit deeper in here and we start to get things animating in or not.
It looks like they aren't anymore.
They aren't anymore. Oh,
I think I
there
saw
it is. There it is. Okay. So most of these blocks, most of these screenshots are animating in like this. And so I think my computer is just struggling. This is the read state. This is where you want it to be when you read. Having it animate in from the left to the right in order to read it, it doesn't actually add anything to the user experience. It's one of those little pieces of delight that doesn't necessarily delight.
I'm so not liking that term delight anymore, because I feel like people just trot it out whenever they want to justify doing something with animation. At first I was really big on this delight thing when I started playing with animation, but then you see people using it in places like this, where did animating those three quotes add anything? Did it reinforce any hierarchy on the page? Did it attract attention to something that people really needed to see? It didn't. There's no reason to animate those three quotes. They could have just been there waiting for the person. The animation
Exactly.
doesn't really add anything to the experience. It's not adding information into this environment. And I've gotten a lot pickier. There are examples in this world of times when animation really does add something and help guide people from place to place. And then there are times when it just seems arbitrary. I try to encourage people to look for the bigger wins when they're using animation.
And so do I. We shouldn't animate just to animate. We need to animate so that we can tell the story in a better way. This is from Vimeo.
Mm-hmm.
They've got this new editing thing, new editing app that you can do, and I don't know that zooming out tells me anything about the story. It gets even worse now that I'm down here. Now the phone is going to flip, and because the computer's working really hard, you don't see the phone flop down as much as you there we go. And this right there, that these little things, do they add anything to this? Maybe they add a little bit, but is it absolutely necessary? It doesn't drive and tell our story any better than if we were to just say have the image there, and then be able to go through the various forms that they wanted to take. So they've got filters that you can apply, and it animates through the filters. Now that seems to work for me. Now just having this video on the screen is a bit of an issue, but going through the various filters is not so bad.
All right, folks, it looks like we had some problems. We had a couple more sites we wanted to go through, but both of our GPUs have decided that enough is enough, and the recording software keeps crashing in spite of multiple resuscitations and reboots. So I think we're at a point where the web has simply maxed out on animations as far as this interview is going. Greg, it has been awesome having you. How can our wonderful watchers and readers catch up with you in the future?
Well, I all over Twitter. My Greg Tarnoff, Tarnoff. You can also visit my site at tarnoff.info, and I will post out there things that I'm writing about. Accessibility being a big piece of that, as well as when I'm speaking at other engagements. So don't have anything currently lined up. So if you know somebody that would like to actually talk about accessibility at a conference, I'm happy to oblige. But there's a list out there, as well as you can see my previous, some links to my previous talks.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today about vestibular disorders and animations and how the two can get intertwingled, as it were. I look forward to seeing more from you in the future.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for coming. Bye.
Bye.